Winter in Belarus in 1944 was a landscape of exhaustion, broken roads, and endless snow. The war had dragged on for years, and every day carried a heavy weight of loss and fear. Among the soldiers and pilots who fought on the Eastern Front, a few names stood out for skill and bravery. Natalia Ivanova was one of them. At just 22 years old, she had earned a reputation not for recklessness, but for precision and discipline. Her comrades trusted her instincts, her judgment, the way she navigated the skis with a steady hand even under fire. She was one of the many women who had answered the call to serve in the Soviet Air Force, part of the all-female aviation units that were a point of pride for a country desperate for heroes. She carried her role with quiet determination, but even the most skilled pilot could not escape the chaos of war. On the morning of December 12th, the air was clear but biting, the wind sharp enough to cut through the thick flight suits and scarves that the pilots wore. Natalia's mission was straightforward, or so it seemed. She was assigned a reconnaissance flight over enemy-controlled territory near Vitebsk, a region where German defenses had grown increasingly entrenched. The reports coming in from intelligence were inconsistent, and commanders were desperate for confirmation of troop movements, supply lines, and the positions of anti-aircraft batteries. Natalia's unit consisted of 3 other pilots, all of them familiar with the dangers of flying over such hostile territory. But even among them, her meticulous attention to detail was unmatched. She checked her instruments twice, confirmed her coordinates, and performed the final pre-flight inspection of her Yakovlev fighter before climbing into the cockpit. The radio chatter was the last anyone would hear from her clearly. A voice, calm but tinged with urgency, reported signs of enemy activity. "I see flak multiple positions adjusting course," she said, her tone precise but slightly strained. Then there was a pause, a faint static crackle, and a final chilling transmission. "They've spotted me, going low." The signal ended abruptly, leaving her squadron with nothing but uncertainty. Attempts to contact her over the next hour yielded only static. When her squadron returned to base, the reality of her absence became immediate and unsettling. Natalia was nowhere on the landing logs. Her plane had not returned. There was no smoke on the horizon, no wreckage visible through the snow-blanketed forest. The commanding officer frowned at the empty spot in the schedule, then ordered a search, but the conditions were brutal. Snowdrifts covered tracks almost as soon as they were made. Wind howled through the trees, drowning out any faint signals or distant cries. Ground teams scoured the nearest villages, questioning locals, but everyone had their own story and none matched. Villagers spoke of a plane diving low over the forest, the engine screaming, but no one had seen a crash. Others claimed to have seen something descend with the wind, like a shadow slipping behind a ridge. Nothing concrete, nothing that would guide the search parties. Fellow pilots struggled with disbelief. Natalia had been careful, precise, and skilled. She had flown countless missions in similar conditions and had returned every single time. The idea that she could simply vanish in mid-flight was almost unthinkable. Yet here they were, staring at blank logs, missing instruments, and the eerie emptiness of a base without her presence. One of her closest comrades, a young pilot named Irina, replayed every memory of their missions together, searching for a sign, a misstep, anything that could explain the disappearance. She remembered Natalia adjusting her flaps midair with almost mechanical precision, guiding her plane through narrow passes, dodging anti-aircraft fire while maintaining composure. How could someone so skilled simply disappear? The military attempted to rationalize the loss, cataloging possible explanations that ranged from mechanical failure to enemy capture. The aircraft itself was a rugged, reliable model, and there had been no prior reports of malfunctions. Enemy reports were silent. The Germans, entrenched in their positions, left no record of a shoot-down in the area at that time. Search parties were deployed on foot, sled, and vehicle, combing through the forest for days. They brought back nothing but scattered debris unrelated to aircraft, fallen branches, the remnants of supply crates, but no sign of Natalia or her plane. The silence became a weight on the base, a constant reminder that even the most thorough procedures could fail in the chaos of war. Back at the barracks, commanders debated the next steps. Letters were drafted to her family, carefully worded to convey the uncertainty without delivering false hope. Each word weighed heavily, knowing that her parents would read the report with a mixture of fear and denial. Some officers clung to hope that she had survived a crash and was being held captive, perhaps hidden by locals or prisoners of war. Others feared the worst, imagining that the forest had swallowed both pilot and plane without leaving a trace. The tension was palpable, and rumors began to circulate among the other pilots. Some whispered that she had been taken by enemy forces and transported to a distant camp. Others suggested that she had been forced to land behind enemy lines and was hiding, waiting for rescue that would never come. Every theory felt both plausible and insufficient, each shadowed by the uncertainty that had become her disappearance. The psychological toll on the squadron was immediate. Pilots flew missions with heightened caution, their eyes scanning the skies for threats, for signs, for answers that never came. The base itself seemed quieter, emptier, as if the air had shifted when Natalia vanished. Soldiers reported dreams of her voice over the radio, static-laden transmissions that seemed urgent but indecipherable. Officers struggled to maintain morale while grappling with the impossibility of the situation. And for those closest to her, grief was intertwined with frustration and disbelief. They spoke of her as if she were still present, recounting her jokes, her habits, her meticulous nature, and the sharp edge of her focus. In doing so, they kept her memory alive, but also magnified the absence, the emptiness that no search party could fill. As days turned to weeks, the search parties were gradually called back, redirected to other operations. Winter tightened its grip, making further expeditions nearly impossible. Commanders filed reports, marking Natalia as missing in action, but with a note that reflected the uncertainty. No wreckage, no witness confirmation, possible capture or crash. The designation felt inadequate to those who knew her well. It failed to capture the sharp reality of her absence. The way an empty cockpit seat can echo through a barracks, the way her name appeared in logs without explanation, the way the wind in the trees seemed to whisper that something had been lost but not found. In those first days and weeks, the story of Natalia Ivanova began to take on a life of its own. Among pilots, her name was spoken in hushed tones, a mix of reverence and fear. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how even the most skilled could vanish without a trace in the chaos of war. Yet for her family, for her squadron, and for the small community of those who had served alongside her, the truth remained elusive. She was out there somewhere, or had been, and no one could say whether she had survived, been captured, or fallen in a place where no human hand would ever recover her. Even as winter gave way to spring, the empty cockpit seat remained. The forest kept its secrets, the village stories contradicted one another, and the base moved forward with the business of war, carrying with it the unspoken acknowledgement that Natalia Ivanova had slipped beyond reach. For those who had known her, the questions lingered like the cold air over the snow. What had happened in those final moments? Was she aware of her fate? Did she fight? Did she try to survive? Or did the forest take her before she had a chance to call for help again? And so the story of her disappearance remained open, haunting, unresolved, setting the stage for the decades-long search for answers that would only begin to resurface far from the Eastern Front, in a place and time no one could have predicted. The day Natalia Ivanova vanished, military authorities responded with urgency, but the reality of searching in a war-torn landscape was far from straightforward. Orders were issued to launch a formal search, and squads were dispatched in multiple directions, through snow-packed forests, over frozen rivers, and into the scattered villages that dotted the Belarusian countryside. Each step was hampered by the harsh winter, the dense tree cover, and the constant threat of enemy patrols. Even experienced trackers struggled to distinguish plane wreckage from the scattered debris of a long-fought front. The forest seemed indifferent to the urgency of the search. Its silent, snow-laden trees holding secrets Natalia may never have revealed. Witness reports arrived in fragments, often contradictory, creating a web of uncertainty. A farmer's son claimed he saw a plane spiral downward, engines screaming as it seemed to vanish behind a ridge. A partisan fighter insisted he glimpsed a parachute floating silently, only to see it disappear into the tree line. Villagers spoke of distant flashes of fire and the echo of a lone engine fatting into the wind. Each account was recorded meticulously, yet none provided verifiable coordinates. Officers noted the inconsistencies with growing concern. It was as if Natalia had slipped between layers of reality, visible one moment, gone the next. Each lead required cross-referencing with maps, flight logs, and known enemy positions, yet the results only deepened the mystery. At the command center, investigators began compiling every detail available. Flight paths were reconstructed using Natalia's last transmission and the movements of her squadron. Meteorological reports were analyzed to determine how wind, snow, and temperature could have affected both the aircraft and potential witnesses. Anti-aircraft positions were mapped from intelligence reports, noting the likely trajectory she would have taken to avoid detection. Every possible scenario was considered: mechanical failure, enemy fire, evasive maneuvers gone wrong, or even the possibility of a forced landing behind enemy lines. Each theory was weighed, and each was undermined by the lack of evidence. Pilots who had flown with Natalia were interviewed at length. They recounted the final moments they remembered, the faint static of her last radio transmissions, and their own maneuvers to evade enemy fire. The emotional strain was evident. Even the most stoic officers found themselves unsettled by the way her absence clung to the base. One pilot described replaying her final call in his mind, the urgency in her voice lingering long after the radio fell silent. Their testimony was invaluable for reconstructing potential flight paths, but it offered no answers. All that remained was the haunting question: what had happened after she went silent? Meanwhile, teams scoured villages near the presumed flight path. Soldiers asked questions, offered rewards for information, and recorded every memory, however faint. In some villages, residents remembered the day clearly. In others, years of occupation and displacement blurred the timeline. Some reported seeing a damaged plane landing in a nearby clearing, only to find the area empty when they investigated. Others claimed soldiers had confiscated wreckage, leaving behind nothing but fragments. Every piece of testimony was cataloged, yet none provided definitive proof of Natalia's fate. The search felt increasingly like grasping at shadows the longer it continued. The procedural rigor of the investigation became almost obsessive. Officers checked every available log, every recorded flight path, and every communication recorded that day. Radio chatter from other units was reconstructed, and attempts were made to triangulate Natalia's final position using the last signals received. Engineers and mechanics examined reports of mechanical issues in similar aircraft to see if a pattern could suggest a failure. Meteorologists calculated snow drifts and wind speeds to determine where wreckage might have landed. Yet, each lead eventually fizzled into uncertainty. Snow had likely covered any tracks. Winds may have moved wreckage, leaving the landscape unrecognizable. The war itself acted as an enemy, burying evidence under its own chaos. As the official investigation wore on, the human cost of Natalia's disappearance began to manifest. Her parents received telegrams and letters, each carefully worded by military officials to communicate concern without committing to definitive answers. Their correspondence reflects both hope and dread. In one letter, her mother wrote of imagining Natalia returning home, of her uniform folded neatly in the corner of the room, waiting to be worn again. In another, her father confessed sleepless nights, wandering the perimeter of their property, as if he could spot her plane descending from the sky. The letters, now archived, show a family suspended in uncertainty, living each day with the invisible weight of a missing daughter. Even for Natalia's squadron, the the investigation had an emotional toll. Pilots who had shared missions and close quarters with her replayed every memory, searching for a mistake, a missed warning, or a decision that could explain her absence. Some believed that even in a crash, Natalia's skill would have carried her farther than anyone could anticipate. Others feared she had been taken by enemy forces, trapped in a place where rescue was impossible. The uncertainty became a psychological burden, a shadow over every mission, every training exercise, and every communication from the front. The search operations extended into enemy-controlled areas, a hazardous undertaking that required both courage and coordination. Small reconnaissance teams moved cautiously, hoping to find either the pilot or evidence of the aircraft. Yet every village they entered had its own story, conflicting and inconclusive. A local partisan who had claimed to see a parachute in the trees could not identify whether it had been her. Another reported hearing a loud crash in the distance, but when the team reached the area, there was only untouched snow. Even the terrain itself, harsh and unforgiving, seemed determined to conceal the truth. Officers noted the improbability of finding the wreckage in such conditions, yet every lead was pursued with determination, a reflection of both duty and hope. By the third week, official reports began to classify Natalia as missing in action. This designation was neither acceptance nor closure, but an acknowledgement of the limits of the investigation. Officers continued to document every possible lead, yet even as they wrote summaries of search efforts and witness accounts, the lack of concrete evidence became painfully clear. Each page in the report reflects not just procedural thoroughness, but a quiet frustration and a creeping sense of helplessness. For those who had known her, these reports were a stark reminder that, despite all efforts, Natalia Ivanova remained absent from a world that had once been familiar. Throughout the investigation, fragments of hope persisted. Occasionally, a villager or soldier would report a potential sighting, prompting small, urgent expeditions. Sometimes these efforts yielded small pieces of debris or traces of tire marks in the snow, but never enough to confirm Natalia's presence or her fate. Investigators documented these leads carefully, cross-referencing them with radar logs, flight paths, and environmental conditions, but the results were invariably inconclusive. Each failure added weight to the uncertainty, yet each report also reflected the determination of those committed to uncovering the truth. While military authorities struggled to find her, the disappearance began to ripple outward in subtle ways. Letters to family, statements from squadron members, and local reports created a web of human concern, each person invested in a life suspended between survival and loss. The longer Natalia remained missing, the more her absence shaped the lives of those connected to her. Fellow pilots flew with a quiet vigilance, conscious of how quickly someone could vanish from the sky. Families of other missing servicemen followed the story with anxious attention, recognizing in Natalia's fate the fragility of life on the front lines. Even as the investigation continued, the forest, the villages, and the snow-covered landscape seemed indifferent. There were no signals, no footsteps, no debris to confirm her location. Every methodical procedure, from analyzing flight patterns to interviewing witnesses, led to a wall of uncertainty. The meticulous reconstruction of events highlighted not her failure, but the sheer impossibility of certainty in a theater of war. For military authorities, the case was now a series of leads, dead ends, and cautious speculation. For her family and squadron, it was an absence that could not be measured, a silence that could not be filled, a missing presence that defined every remaining day. As the initial urgency of the search faded into the routine of ongoing war operations, one question persisted, echoing across snowy forests and frozen fields. What had happened to Natalia Ivanova after her last transmission? Each report, each testimony, each piece of evidence or rumor only reinforced the mystery. She had flown with skill and caution, yet she had vanished. And in that disappearance, every official procedure, every search, every analysis, every hope converged into a single unanswerable truth. Natalia was gone, and for now, no one could say whether she had fallen, survived, or been carried beyond reach. That lingering uncertainty would shape the decades-long search for answers, a search that would eventually span generations and lead to a discovery no one at the time could have imagined. As weeks turned into months, the urgency that had gripped Natalia Ivanova's squadron and the military command began to dissipate, replaced by the grinding reality of a front that refused to pause for grief. By spring 1945, the Eastern Front had shifted, and priorities changed with every advancing line of troops. Yet even as the world moved forward, whispers about her fate lingered, carried from village to village among soldiers, and in the hushed conversations of those who had witnessed fleeting, unexplained moments. In the forests where search parties had combed for wreckage, locals spoke of strange noises, of glimpses of aircraft spiraling in the distance, and of shadows disappearing behind ridges. Some insisted they had seen a female figure parachuting silently into the trees, while others recalled German soldiers bragging about a pilot who had eluded capture, her identity unknown to them, yet unmistakably a woman. The rumor mill grew in ways both subtle and persistent. Partisan fighters passing through villages added their own claims, recounting skirmishes near crash sites where no wreckage could later be found. One story described a small group of locals carrying away supplies from a downed plane, only to discover it empty, as though the pilot had vanished along with it. Another told of a campfire conversation overheard between German soldiers who spoke in hushed, mocking tones of a Soviet aviator whose daring escapes had frustrated them for weeks. Each tale carried just enough plausibility to survive scrutiny, but lacked concrete proof. Over time, these stories became layered, shifting with retelling, blending fact and imagination in ways that ensured Natalia's disappearance would linger as a legend before it became a documented tragedy. Soviet propaganda briefly intervened to commemorate her service, highlighting the bravery of female pilots in the Air Force. Her name appeared in a printed circular, a small photograph showing a young woman in uniform, her face determined, her eyes steady. The narrative painted her as heroic, emblematic of the courage expected of all Soviet servicemen and women. Yet these tributes were brief, and the war's relentless demands quickly overshadowed them. As battles intensified, and as news of victories and losses dominated every communication channel, Natalia's story faded from the front lines, leaving only the memory of her disappearance to those who had known her personally. The propaganda framed her as a hero, but for those left behind, the squadron, her family, the few who had glimpsed her flight path, the heroism was inseparable from the torment of not knowing. Decades passed, and the landscape of war changed as much as the people who had lived it. The forests and fields where she had vanished remained largely untouched, their snowy expanses giving way to overgrowth, rivers shifting course, and roads that had been torn apart by conflict slowly healing with time. Memories dimmed, and many of those who had been present at the front were gone, whether claimed by war or age. Yet even as the human witnesses dwindled, Natalia's story persisted in records, official and informal. Military archives preserved flight logs, radio transmissions, and correspondence, all cataloged with the meticulous attention typical of Soviet bureaucracy. For historians decades later, these documents offered tantalizing hints, fragments that could be pieced together but never fully verified. Amateur aviation researchers and history enthusiasts began combing these archives, drawn by the mystery of a skilled young woman whose flight had ended in silence. They studied flight manifests, cross-referenced radio logs, and examined meteorological records from the day of her disappearance. Survivors of the war, pilots, mechanics, villagers, were interviewed where possible, their recollections recorded for posterity. Some accounts confirmed known details: her last transmission, the flight path, the weather conditions. Others contradicted these facts, introducing possibilities that ranged from crash landings hidden by locals to capture by enemy forces and subsequent concealment. Each new narrative added layers to the mystery, enriching the story but also making the truth ever more elusive. The conflicting narratives, though compelling, created frustration as much as fascination. Some suggested she had been shot down behind enemy lines and quietly interred in a makeshift grave by partisans. Others theorized she had managed a forced landing and survived for several days, only to succumb to injury or the harsh winter. Every lead seemed plausible, but verification remained impossible. Even satellite images and modern reconnaissance could do little to corroborate the scattered testimony of villagers who were long gone or the recollections of soldiers whose memories had faded over decades. The result was a story suspended between certainty and conjecture, a haunting puzzle for anyone who sought closure. Yet it was precisely this ambiguity that gave Natalia Ivanova's story its weight. In the absence of clear answers, she became a ghostly figure in both history and memory, a symbol of the countless unknown fates that hung in the air over the Eastern Front. She was remembered not just for her courage, but for the unresolved nature of her disappearance. The story invited speculation, reflection, and a lingering sense of unease, reminding historians and enthusiasts alike that even meticulous records and rigorous investigations could fail to capture the totality of a life lost in war. Letters preserved in family archives offer further glimpses into the emotional fallout. Her mother wrote of waiting by the window for letters that never arrived, tracing flight paths on maps in hope, as if charting the invisible course Natalia might have taken could conjure her presence. Her father meticulously examined every piece of military correspondence, cataloging telegrams, and making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Even decades later, these artifacts illustrate the human dimension of a disappearance that, in official records, risked being reduced to a set of coordinates and dates. The family's grief was not simply over loss, but over the impossibility of closure, a pain compounded by the passage of time and the absence of tangible proof. As rumors circulated and the war finally ended, Natalia's disappearance became part of the larger narrative of missing aviators, women and men alike, whose fates were swallowed by the chaos of conflict. Veteran pilots spoke of her in interviews years later, recounting how her absence had influenced their own perceptions of survival and mortality. The mystery persisted in military circles, referenced in flight training manuals as a cautionary tale, cited in discussions of reconnaissance hazards, and occasionally invoked in memoirs that sought to preserve the memory of those lost without explanation. Her story became emblematic of the fragility of life in war and the challenges faced by those left behind. In the following decades, small discoveries kept the story alive. A fragment of aircraft metal appeared in a farmer's field, later attributed to similar models but not conclusively linked to Natalia's plane. A faded journal entry in a veteran's memoir described a female pilot seen near Vitebsk, prompting historians to revisit original records. Yet every lead, every scrap of evidence, proved insufficient to resolve the mystery. The search shifted from immediate action to historical inquiry, a transformation that allowed for reflection, analysis, and speculation, but also underscored the persistent gaps in the record. By the late 20th century, Natalia had achieved a form of immortality in historical memory. She was referenced in studies of women in combat aviation, cited in local histories of Belarus, and included in broader examinations of World War II reconnaissance missions. But she remained, in essence, a ghost, her ultimate fate unknowable, her life defined as much by what could not be confirmed as by what could. The emotional tension surrounding her story persisted, intensified by decades of silence, speculation, and partial evidence. She existed between history and myth, between recorded fact and the human need for closure, a figure suspended in time and memory. The cold case that began with a missing transmission, an empty cockpit, and a forest that refused to yield her secrets continued to haunt those who studied it. Natalia Ivanova's story illustrates the profound complexity of wartime disappearance, the limits of procedural investigation, and the enduring human impulse to seek meaning in the absence of certainty. Even as new generations of historians and enthusiasts took up the challenge, each attempt to reconstruct her final hours only reinforced the central truth. She had vanished, leaving behind fragments, rumors, and memories that would outlast the immediate context of the war itself. In this way, she became both a historical figure and a haunting presence, bridging decades of inquiry and speculation, a reminder of the lives that quietly disappear in the shadow of larger conflicts. 79 years had passed since Natalia Ivanova vanished over the forests of Belarus, decades during which her story had drifted through rumors, archives, and fragmented memories. The war itself had receded into history, leaving the forests, villages, and snow-covered fields to heal in silence. Generations had grown up without knowing the details of her disappearance, her name appearing only sporadically in history books or local tailies. The world had moved on, and yet the memory of her flight lingered in hidden ways, waiting for the right circumstances to resurface. It was in the early spring of 2023 when the first tangible trace of her past emerged. A forestry crew had been clearing an area of dense woodland in the remote outskirts of Vitebsk, a region still thick with untouched forest despite modern development. The crew worked mechanically, moving fallen trees and clearing underbrush, unaware that beneath the thick carpet of moss and snow lay a secret that had slept for nearly 8 decades. One of the workers struck a rusted piece of metal with a chainsaw, revealing a section of what appeared to be a plane's fuselage, partially buried under soil, roots, and the accumulated debris of 79 winters. Initial reports were vague, almost casual, a piece of old aircraft discovered in the forest. Yet the significance of the find quickly became apparent when photographs were sent to local authorities. Aviation historians and museum curators were contacted, their curiosity piqued by the possibility of recovering a long-lost wartime aircraft. The first expert on the scene, Dr. Mikhail Petrov, a respected historian specializing in Soviet aviation, immediately recognized the design and structure. The construction, the curvature of the fuselage, and the positioning of the rivets were consistent with a Yakovlev fighter plane from the early 1940s. The identification was rapid, but even as the initial excitement spread, the sense of gravity deepened. This was not just metal, it was a tangible link to a life and story that had vanished decades ago. Authorities quickly secured the site, cordoning off the area to preserve potential evidence. Forensic teams were brought in to document every fragment, every piece of debris. Each item was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed with painstaking detail. The fuselage was examined for serial numbers etched into the metal, numbers that could be cross-referenced with wartime manufacturing logs. Remarkably, the serial numbers matched those assigned to Natalia Ivanova's aircraft, a confirmation that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Instruments found inside the cockpit, the altimeter, compass, and communication equipment, were still largely intact, providing forensic experts with unprecedented insight into the final moments of her flight. Construction materials were analyzed in specialized laboratories. Metallurgists examined the composition of the fuselage, confirming it corresponded to the alloys used in Soviet fighters produced in 1944. Flight instruments were cross-checked against military records, revealing not only the model, but the exact configuration that had been standard for reconnaissance missions in Natalia's unit. Each finding further narrowed the possibilities, eliminating doubts and affirming that this was indeed the plane she had flown on that fateful winter day so many decades ago. Even small personal artifacts were discovered: a leather glove, weathered but preserved, fragments of a flight log, and a small photograph of a family member tucked into a compartment of the cockpit. These items transformed the wreckage from historical debris into a deeply personal connection, bridging the decades between Natalia's life and the world that had forgotten her. Word of the discovery spread quickly, reaching historians, aviation enthusiasts, and surviving veterans who had known Natalia personally. For some, decades had passed, their memories dulled by time, yet the discovery reignited recollections as vivid as the day they had last heard her voice over the radio. Former squadron members were contacted, and in calls and emails filled with disbelief and emotion, they recounted her skill, her precision, and the shock of losing her to the unknown. Tears were shed over phone lines and in quiet rooms as veterans realized that, after nearly 8 decades, the mystery of her disappearance had finally produced a concrete trace. Family members, many now in their 70s or 80s, were notified in a carefully coordinated effort. The emotional impact was immediate and profound. Natalia's descendants, long aware only of fragments of her story and the enduring grief of earlier generations, were suddenly confronted with the reality of her final flight. Letters, photographs, and official military documents were examined side by side with the recovered artifacts. For the first time, they could touch a piece of her past, hold a physical connection to a woman who had existed only in stories, rumors, and fading memories. The grief of decades mingled with awe and relief, a confirmation that Natalia had not simply disappeared into legend, but had met a fate that could now, in part, be reconstructed. The investigative process at the site was methodical. Archaeologists and forensic experts used ground-penetrating radar to map the area around the plane, searching for additional debris or evidence of a crash landing that might have remained hidden under soil and tree roots. Soil samples were analyzed for traces of human remains, though the passage of nearly 8 decades and the environmental conditions made recovery unlikely. Every measurement, every calculation was documented with precision, emphasizing the seriousness with which authorities treated this historical find. Forensic aviation teams reconstructed the approximate flight path leading to the crash, accounting for wind, altitude, and any maneuvers Natalia may have attempted to evade detection or enemy fire. Each new piece of evidence revealed a story that had remained silent for nearly 8 decades. The instruments suggested she had been attempting evasive maneuvers, adjusting altitude and course in a desperate bid to escape what the last transmissions hinted might have been anti-aircraft fire. Damage to the fuselage indicated a combination of mechanical stress and collision with tree branches, consistent with a forced landing in a dense, forested area. Yet the absence of human remains created a lingering uncertainty, a haunting reminder that even in discovery, some mysteries remain. For Natalia's family, this was both a closure and a continuation, a revelation tempered by the knowledge that her ultimate fate remained partially unknown. As news spread globally, aviation historians began piecing together the implications of the find. Scholarly papers, museum exhibitions, and local historical societies examined Natalia's life and service, incorporating the recovered artifacts into broader narratives about female pilots in the Soviet Air Force. Interviews with surviving veterans, combined with the forensic findings, allowed researchers to reconstruct a timeline of her final mission with unprecedented clarity. The historical significance was enormous. A woman who had vanished without a trace in 1944 was now, through debris and documents, reconnected to history, providing insight into both the technological and human aspects of wartime aviation. The emotional resonance of the discovery extended beyond academic circles. Descendants visited the site where the plane had been found, tracing the perimeter of the forest clearing and envisioning the moment their ancestor had made her final maneuvers. They examined the flight instruments, gently handled the leather glove, and held the photograph, connecting across time to a life interrupted but not forgotten. For them, Natalia Ivanova was no longer just a name on a faded document. She was a pilot, a daughter, a young woman whose courage had taken her to the edge of survival and whose legacy had endured long enough to be rediscovered. Even in the modern era, the discovery sparked conversations about memory, loss, and the passage of time. The forest that had once concealed Natalia and her plane now stood as a testament to resilience, both of the natural world and of human curiosity. For scholars, veterans, and family members alike, the recovery symbolized the enduring desire to reconcile with the past, to honor those who had disappeared in service, and to confront the fragility and unpredictability of life in wartime. Yet despite the clarity brought by the aircraft's identification and forensic analysis, questions remained. Why had the plane ended up in such a remote location? Could Natalia have survived the initial crash? Had she attempted to move, to seek shelter, or had the forest itself claimed her in those first moments after impact? Every artifact, every fragment of metal, answered part of the story while leaving the most human elements, the fear, the final decisions, the struggle for survival, forever shrouded in mystery. And in that uncertainty lay the enduring power of her story, a story recovered from history, yet never fully complete, a narrative suspended between fact and the human imagination. As the forestry crew looked back on the clearing where their work had uncovered the plane, they could scarcely comprehend the significance of what they had discovered. A single action cutting through underbrush had unlocked a decades-old mystery, transforming rumors and fragmented memory into tangible evidence. For the modern world, it was a reminder that history is never entirely closed, that even the most enduring silences can, under the right circumstances, be broken. For Natalia Ivanova, it was a posthumous return to recognition, a reclamation of a life and service that had been overshadowed by the fog of war. And as descendants, historians, and surviving veterans gathered around the site, the forest seemed to hold its breath, offering a solemn acknowledgement of what had been lost and what, finally, had been found. With the discovery of the wreckage, forensic investigators began the painstaking task of reconstructing Natalia Ivanova's final hours. Every fragment of metal, every bent rivet, and every broken instrument became a piece of the puzzle. The initial focus was on the aircraft itself, the Yakovlev fighter that had carried her across the Eastern Front all those decades ago. Experts meticulously documented the fuselage, the wings, and the cockpit, noting how each component had been stressed, deformed, or fractured over time. Using these observations, they began to recreate the moments leading up to the crash, combining physical evidence with historical records, weather reports, and the sparse but invaluable military communications from the day of her disappearance. One of the first conclusions drawn from the wreckage was that Natalia had attempted evasive maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. Damage patterns on the fuselage and wings suggested abrupt banking and rapid altitude changes consistent with a pilot attempting to escape anti-aircraft positions. The tail section showed signs of impact consistent with rapid descent, likely the result of a mechanical failure compounded by her evasive actions. Investigators noted that the stress marks on the landing gear and fuselage suggested she had tried to stabilize the plane before losing control entirely. It was a chilling reminder of the split-second decisions pilots had to make in life-or-death situations, decisions that were invisible to anyone who was not in the cockpit. The forest itself had played a role in both the preservation and concealment of evidence. Trees had absorbed portions of the plane's impact, slowing its descent in some areas while redirecting it into a ravine where soil and debris quickly covered large sections of the aircraft. The ravine acted as a natural coffin, preserving key elements of the wreckage while leaving other aspects vulnerable to decades of weathering and decomposition. Forensic teams conducted soil analysis and used ground-penetrating radar to determine the depth and spread of the debris field. The pattern suggested that the plane had spun into the ravine, breaking apart on impact but remaining largely intact in pockets, which allowed investigators to match individual fragments with historical blueprints of the aircraft. Among the most poignant discoveries were the personal items that had survived decades of exposure. A leather glove, partially charred but remarkably preserved, was found near the cockpit area. It bore signs of wear consistent with repeated use, a small, intimate artifact connecting Natalia to the person behind the pilot's uniform. Inside the cockpit, fragments of a flight log were recovered, yellowed with age but legible under careful examination. Names, coordinates, and brief notes detailed her mission plan, the expected enemy positions, and even small personal annotations that hinted at her meticulous nature and the attention she gave to her craft. In a small compartment near the instrument panel, investigators found a photograph, faded but still recognizable, a family portrait, a reminder that behind the bravery and duty, there was a young woman with loved ones waiting for her return. These artifacts transformed the investigation from a technical exercise into a profoundly human narrative, bridging the decades of silence. Forensic analysis extended beyond the aircraft to consider what Natalia may have experienced in her final moments. Damage to the control column and rudder indicated she had maintained some level of control even as the plane began to spiral, a testament to her skill and training. The sequence of structural failures suggested that a sudden mechanical issue, perhaps a jammed aileron or a broken hydraulic line, combined with evasive maneuvers, caused the aircraft to enter an unrecoverable spin. Investigators debated the likelihood that she had been conscious and attempting to correct the descent until the very end. Some argued that the rapid loss of altitude would have rendered survival impossible, while others considered the possibility that she had briefly survived the initial impact before succumbing to injuries or exposure. The absence of human remains left this question hauntingly open, adding a layer of emotional weight to the scientific reconstruction. The reconstruction of her flight path was informed not only by the physical evidence, but also by historical records and weather data from December 1944. Wind patterns, temperature, and snow accumulation were analyzed to understand how they may have affected her trajectory. Radar logs and radio transmissions from her squadron were used to approximate her final coordinates and timing. This combination of forensic science and historical methodology allowed investigators to build a plausible narrative. Natalia had flown low to evade enemy detection, maneuvered aggressively in response to anti-aircraft fire, and encountered a critical mechanical failure that forced her plane off course into a densely forested ravine. Each step of the reconstruction painted a picture of courage and skill, a narrative that, despite its tragic outcome, highlighted the expertise of a pilot who had been trained to survive the impossible. The emotional intensity of the investigation grew as the personal artifacts were cataloged and shared with Natalia's descendants and surviving veterans. For family members, seeing the glove, the flight log, and the photograph was both devastating and profoundly moving. These objects provided a tangible connection to a life that had otherwise been defined by absence. Veterans who had served alongside Natalia were contacted and invited to review the findings. Their recollections, long dormant, resurfaced in vivid detail. The voice over the radio, the final formation flight, the meticulous way she prepped her plane. Many admitted to being overwhelmed by the convergence of memory and evidence, as if decades of silence had suddenly been pierced by the tangible reality of her final moments. The debate among experts regarding her survival underscored the tension between science and emotion. Medical analysts considered the severity of injuries likely sustained in the crash, estimating that even a skilled pilot might have been incapacitated instantly. Others considered the possibility of partial survival, a brief period during which Natalia could have struggled to escape the wreckage or move toward shelter. Every scenario carried profound implications, both practical and emotional. The uncertainty mirrored the very essence of her decades-long disappearance. Even with the plane recovered and the circumstances reconstructed, the human element, the struggle, the fear, the final thoughts of a young woman alone in the forest, remained beyond reach. Further forensic work focused on mapping the exact distribution of debris within the ravine. Investigators noted how parts of the fuselage had split along stress points, how branches and soil had altered the trajectory of smaller components, and how corrosion over time had affected their appearance. Using three-dimensional modeling, experts were able to digitally reconstruct the crash, providing a visual approximation of how the aircraft had entered the ravine, spun, and broken apart. This digital reconstruction allowed researchers, historians, and even descendants to visualize, for the first time, the final moments of Natalia's mission in a controlled, analytical environment. Yet even with these tools, the narrative retained an element of the unknowable, a reminder that the precise human experience of those moments could never be fully captured. The psychological weight of the reconstruction extended beyond the investigators. For descendants, every technical detail highlighted the reality of the danger she had faced. The evasive maneuvers, the critical failure, the crash itself, all underscored the precariousness of life at the front and the bravery required to face it. For veterans, the analysis offered a sense of closure, a way to reconcile decades of unanswered questions. They spoke of her skill and dedication, noting that the evidence corroborated what they had always believed, that Natalia had fought with every tool, every ounce of training, and every instinct at her disposal. The discovery and reconstruction bridged the temporal gap, connecting modern observers with the human story of 1944 in a visceral, almost tangible way. As the investigation drew to a preliminary conclusion, the overarching narrative became clear. Natalia Ivanova had flown with precision, courage, and determination. She had faced enemy fire, executed complex maneuvers, and encountered mechanical failure that ultimately claimed her aircraft. The wreckage, the artifacts, and the forensic analysis all told a consistent story of skill, desperation, and tragedy. Yet the human element, the question of whether she had survived the initial impact, the sensation of the cold wind in the ravine, the thoughts racing through her mind, remained unresolved. In this intersection of scientific rigor and emotional intensity, Natalia's story retained its haunting quality, bridging decades of uncertainty while finally providing a coherent reconstruction of her final hours. Even as experts finalized their reports, the crash site continued to evoke awe and sorrow. Forensic teams documented their findings meticulously, creating an archive that would serve historians, descendants, and aviation enthusiasts alike. The site itself, preserved as a historical location, stood as a testament to both her skill and the relentless unpredictability of war. Every artifact, every scrap of metal, every trace of personal belonging became a reminder of the life behind the legend, a tangible connection to a young woman whose courage had endured long after the engines fell silent. Through this meticulous reconstruction, Natalia Ivanova's story transformed from a vague wartime disappearance into a detailed, humanized account of skill, courage, and loss. While her ultimate fate remained partly unknown, the combination of evidence, historical records, and personal artifacts allowed both experts and descendants to imagine, with remarkable clarity, the last moments of her life. In doing so, they honored not just the pilot, but the person, the daughter, and the hero who had vanished over the Eastern Front, creating a narrative that was as scientifically robust as it was emotionally resonant. Even after the wreckage of Natalia Ivanova's aircraft had been carefully documented and analyzed, the sense of incompletion lingered like a shadow over the forest. Every fragment of fuselage, every instrument, every personal artifact told part of her story, but the question of her final moments remained unanswered in the most intimate sense. Investigators could reconstruct her maneuvers, her likely reactions to enemy fire, and the sequence of mechanical failures that led to the crash, yet her physical presence, the human body behind the cockpit, was nowhere to be found. This absence, both tangible and symbolic, would define the conclusion of her story, leaving an indelible mark on family, historians, and all who had followed her decades-long disappearance. For Natalia's descendants, the discovery had been simultaneously miraculous and devastating. They had traveled to Belarus to see the site firsthand, stepping into a clearing where nature had concealed and preserved fragments of a long-lost past. They handled her leather glove, traced the markings on the cockpit instruments, and examined the photograph of a family member that had remained hidden for nearly 8 decades. These objects provided a connection to her life, a way to touch something she had touched, to see something she had seen. Yet the absence of her remains created an emptiness that could not be reconciled. The reunion with history was bittersweet. The joy of tangible evidence was inseparable from the sorrow that her body had never been recovered, that the forest held the ultimate secret of her fate. Aviation historians took the opportunity to publish detailed reports, meticulously documenting the wreckage, the forensic analysis, and the reconstruction of her flight path. These reports confirmed, for the first time, the technical details of her final mission. A skilled pilot confronted by enemy anti-aircraft fire, attempting evasive maneuvers, and ultimately overcome by mechanical failure that forced her plane into a ravine. These publications represented a measure of closure, providing the historical certainty that had eluded families and colleagues for generations. Yet even as the narrative of the aircraft was confirmed, the human element, the question of her final thoughts, her struggle, and the moment of impact, remained tantalizingly, hauntingly unresolved. For those who had flown alongside her during the war, the confirmation of the crash was both relief and grief. Veterans who had carried the weight of unanswered questions for decades finally had tangible evidence that Natalia's disappearance was not the result of desertion or error, but of circumstance and misfortune. Their memories of her, the precision of her flying, the camaraderie in the squadron, the warmth and determination behind her youthful eyes, were validated, yet they were also reminded that the final reality of her experience would forever remain hidden. There would never be a body to honor, no grave to visit, only the wreckage and the fragments of a life abruptly halted. The emotional resonance of the discovery extended to the broader public as well. Exhibitions were organized, showcasing the plane's remnants, her flight instruments, and photographs recovered from the cockpit. Visitors were struck by the juxtaposition of technical detail and human vulnerability, the cold metal of the fuselage, scarred and rusted, beside a small, personal photograph that survived decades of snow, rain, and decay. It was a visceral reminder that war is not merely about strategies and victories, but about individual lives, lives that vanish suddenly and leave only fragments behind. For many, Natalia became emblematic of the countless soldiers and pilots who disappeared, whose stories were incomplete, yet whose courage demanded remembrance. Researchers and historians continued to debate the unanswered questions, particularly regarding whether Natalia had survived the initial crash. Some argued that the severity of the plane's impact and the limited evidence suggested immediate death. Others speculated that she could have survived briefly, perhaps attempting to crawl from the cockpit, seeking shelter in the snow-laden ravine, only to succumb to injury or exposure. Each theory highlighted a tension between what could be scientifically inferred and what would forever remain unknowable. This tension became a central aspect of her story, a haunting reminder of the limits of historical reconstruction and the enduring mystery of human experience. Letters and correspondence from her family, preserved over decades, took on renewed significance in the wake of the discovery. Natalia's descendants read the telegrams, letters, and memoirs left behind by parents and siblings who had lived with uncertainty for years. The artifacts recovered from the crash created a bridge between past and present, allowing modern family members to connect with emotions long felt but never fully understood. The leather glove, the photograph, the fragments of her flight log, all these items transformed abstract grief into a tangible encounter with history. They symbolized the permanence of memory, even in the absence of the physical body, and reminded the family that closure could exist in fragments, in stories, and in objects that survived the passage of time. The forest that had concealed Natalia's plane for nearly 8 decades remained a silent witness. Snow and soil had preserved the wreckage, but the same environment had erased any direct traces of her life beyond the cockpit. Nature, indifferent yet meticulous, had ensured that only fragments survived, a pattern that mirrored the human experience of loss. Memory is preserved in pieces, stories are reconstructed from evidence, and the ultimate reality often remains beyond reach. Investigators noted that the site would remain protected, both as a historical artifact and as a monument to a life suspended between past and present, tangible yet elusive. Despite the unanswered questions, there was a profound sense of reconciliation with the past. Historians, veterans, and family members alike recognized that the discovery allowed them to honor Natalia's courage and skill, to acknowledge the circumstances of her disappearance, and to provide her story with a definitive, if partial, place in history. The emotional payoff was not in certainty, but in recognition of her bravery, her expertise, and the human dimensions of her final mission. In that recognition, decades of absence and uncertainty were given context, even if the ultimate fate, the moment of her death, would remain unknowable. For aviation enthusiasts, the recovered plane and forensic analysis provided a rare, almost unprecedented opportunity to study a wartime aircraft in situ, to connect technical detail with historical narrative. Yet even in this analytical context, the human story dominated. Each rivet, each instrument panel, each artifact testified not only to engineering, but to a life interrupted, to decisions made under pressure, to the courage of a young woman facing circumstances far beyond ordinary comprehension. This balance between historical documentation and human emotion became central to the legacy of Natalia Ivanova, ensuring that she would be remembered not just as a pilot, but as a person whose story transcended decades of silence. The narrative that emerged was both conclusive and incomplete. Technically, experts could confirm her plane, her final flight path, and the mechanical failures that led to the crash. Emotionally, the story remained unresolved, anchored by the absence of her remains and the unknowable experiences of her final moments. This duality became the defining characteristic of her story, the intersection of fact and mystery, of closure and enduring questions. The recovered wreckage was a testament to historical diligence, yet it also highlighted the limits of human understanding when faced with the vast uncertainties of life, war, and time. As historians, family members, and visitors reflected on the discovery, a broader truth emerged. Natalia Ivanova's story was a meditation on remembrance and loss, a recognition that history is preserved not only in documents and artifacts, but in the emotional connections we maintain across generations. The recovery of her plane provided tangible proof of her fate, but it also preserved the mystery, ensuring that her story would continue to resonate, haunting and inspiring in equal measure. She became, in the truest sense, both remembered and elusive, a life recovered in fragments, yet irretrievably lost. In the final accounting, the discovery offered closure of a sort, but it was closure tempered by the limits of time, nature, and circumstance. Family members could finally see her mission reconstructed, artifacts examined, and her presence acknowledged in the historical record. Veterans could honor her courage, knowing that her disappearance had not been forgotten. Historians could integrate the technical and human details into a fuller understanding of the Eastern Front and the role of Soviet women pilots. And yet, in the absence of her remains, in the unknowable reality of her final struggle, the story retained its haunting quality. Natalia Ivanova had returned to history, but she remained, in a profound and solemn sense, beyond reach, a ghostly figure whose courage and disappearance would forever echo across time.